a podcast then right now?
No, I just want to
Okay.
make sure. I mean, there shouldn't be a huge different feeling from,
Okay.
yeah,
It's pretty conversational.
from when I just have had times where I forget to hit record, and then I mean it's not a waste. It's just, it's just different, when you have to
Yeah.
redo it and you're like doing like you're recording with somebody the second time and
Yeah.
you're like, "Oh yeah, remember when you said that? That was really good. Do that again."
Do
It's
you
just not.
edit? Oh, do you
Yeah,
edit the
I do.
podcasts? Okay.
Some more than others. It's, that's one of those things that depends on time and
Right.
what my week looks like. And you know I do edits for one other podcast, and I do a
Hmm.
pretty good job on hers because it's not mine, and so I want it to be whatever. Like, I take out all the vocalized pauses and take out gaps.
Right.
It's pretty exhausting, but it's like she pays me for it, so I feel like I should
Right.
put a little bit
Yeah,
of
that's good
so that's been fun.
experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And have
been
you gotten pretty good feedback with your podcast?
I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, for the most part, I get like no feedback. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. Um, I have a few, like, I'll definitely won't have this on air. A few Frasier family members that don't like what I have to say. I
Right.
don't know if it's necessarily they don't like my podcast, but they definitely don't like my content on some of my episodes. And I'm like, okay. I was like, I'm
So,
not really making it like for you to like it. Like, I,
right.
I mean, that's fine. So
Sure. Yeah, yeah. You just get that verbally, I'm sure, that
it's,
feedback.
and then I think most people are like, they just don't know how to give feedback. Like, I think my one takeaway from like what I've learned in like marriage and CPE and to a little bit church work is like we only really become better if we can receive feedback. And I think
Yeah.
people are just absolutely terrified to give feedback to other
Hmm.
people, it seems like, or receive it. I don't know.
Yeah. That's true. Those two go together too. I mean, like to hear critique uh, is difficult, but I guess to seek it out is wise.
Yeah, like I mean, you've spent a lot of time teaching wisdom literature and like,
Mhm.
and then personally, like raising three kids, being married, being a part of church, like all those things require like you're spending time grading papers, like that is feedback. And like if
Yeah.
me and you are in a room and it's like you give me a Hebrew quiz and I get answers wrong, you're like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. But it's like,
Right.
and it's fine. You tell me what I did right, and it's like not personal, I guess. Maybe it is for some students. But then if it's like, hey, I'm going to tell you about my marriage and you give me feedback, it's totally different. And
Yeah. There's something about the construct of a classroom
mhm.
that, and the roles are really clearly defined between a teacher and a student. And I think in real life, we don't experience that kind of structure very often. And that really aids giving and receiving critique.
Yeah. And I guess just getting maybe my first question like on that is, okay, I'm talking with my friend Lance, who's a professor at Harding, and when you talk about like you just said like a classroom, there's like this relationship teacher student, and the student comes seeking advice. Like when you're talking about like giving wisdom for your kids, is it like I'm very much in kid mode, parent mode these days, with two kids being at home
Yeah.
literally 24/7 because they're doing school and daycare. My house is a daycare and a school. um
Yeah.
um yeah, like how do you like get, man, this is a messing up the question, but it's like, how is there some way to have that type of teaching relationship with your kids and like how you transition, like now I'm going to teach you something, and
Yeah, that's hard. Like
especially I think
there's,
specifically with like when you're teaching faith, when you're teaching like
yeah.
how to, I don't know, what I think of just like wisdom, like
Hmm.
and more about the wisdom tradition and stuff, so I'm curious about that too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just in real life, practicality, I think that changes some as your kids grow up, at least in
Right.
my experience. Um,
Definitely.
but there's still like when the parent-child relationship is different and needs to be different than
Mhm.
the teacher-student relationship. And I am grateful for those people who have the teacher-student, mentor, kind of spiritual leader role in my kid's life that work
Mm.
kind of fill that role to some extent. I mean, obviously, we're still teachers as parents, and I think a lot of the parental teaching, as far as especially with Christian faith matters, is just by virtue of witness. I mean, you live with your kids; they see what you do in your free time. All of that bears witness to what you believe in, and then like as far as critiquing and some of my kids, it's like walking on eggshells, like because you have wisdom to give, and children need to listen to their parents and their experiences, but in my experience, like telling stories is better than just like straightforward admonition. You shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing this, and I do that probably more than tell stories. But what's really effective is, and what's like lasting is, I think, the combination of witness and like just sharing experiences, being sort of open with places you messed up and lessons you've learned along the way. I mean, there's still times where I like, okay, so the other week, uh, like little things come up all the time. Like,
Mhm.
do my teenage kids wash between their toes? Right. So at a certain point, you don't bathe your kids anymore. Right. And so,
Right, right,
and
right.
now that you lose touch with, are they with their hygiene? And it's like, well, they should be washing behind their ears, let's say. Let's maybe go behind your ears.
Uh-huh.
And it came up in conversation, and I'm like, and I just kept on saying, and it became a joke, but at the same
Sure,
time, I
sure.
was teaching them, it's like, it's important to wash behind your ears. So there's stuff like that I think
Yeah.
you can make sort of, you can let them know this is not the most vital thing in the world, but hey, here's some good advice,
Hmm.
parental
Hmm.
advice. And I think, that, but that's hearing, and that the way that you teach those types of lessons really does factor over into faith matters. Although I think I'm especially careful in some ways with just admonitions about faith. Um,
Hmm. What do you say? You're extra care or very careful or extra?
I don't know. You just pick your times. I mean, I've definitely.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Like you think, okay, so I teach Bible, and
Right.
my kids go to a school where they have Bible classes,
Right.
so they get like biblical teaching, and yet I'm every once in a while I'll become really aware that I have never really sat down with my kids and like walked them through biblical criticism, and I've never sat, or
Yeah.
maybe more importantly, I've never sat them down and like, let's talk about the Psalms and how to pray the Psalms or something. And maybe that's maybe
Well,
a neglected area in my instruction. But
huh.
this is where I come back to, like, they know what I do, and I think there are times where we have conversations, but that just kind of flow out of the quantity of time, and I'll just ask them questions about what they're learning in different areas.
So I know you said you haven't like sat down and talked to them about, the Psalms and, what is, more information about the Psalms. But it's like they did see you like teach in church for how many years? Like
Yeah,
a
yeah, that's
decade?
true. I think that's true. I think that happens better, and that kind of witness and church participation happens better in smaller churches than bigger churches.
Yeah, and
But
so I mean, yeah, because I think about that too. It's like you obviously they've seen you like I've been this phrase of like more is caught than taught.
right,
And
yeah, I agree with
so
that.
they definitely have that from, their kids. So I know that it gets into a little bit of like the parenting stuff, but like I said, that's just where my mind is at
Sure.
in these times. What have when I talk about like winter faith and like the idea of my podcast is like having conversations with people about faith, apathy, everything in between. That I don't think like doubt is the opposite of faith. I think it's like a part of it.
Yeah.
And I know that, you look at Job as wisdom literature and you look at, other people in the Bible as they're like learning and growing. But I was just curious, like, what do you see from the Bible when you see people like wrestling with their faith? Like, is there things in the Bible I should pay attention to and study more when this idea of like winter faith? I always wanted to kind of ask you that. Like, it's like, who had winter faith in the Bible? Because I have my
Yeah.
opinions, but I was curious about what you think of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk about interfaith characters in the Bible, and yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Job, no doubt, comes to mind.
Yeah.
I, on the one hand, like I definitely think that's there, and I totally agree with you that doubt is an important part of faith, and
Mm-hmm.
for some people, they kind of learn to wrestle with that at more than others, and it's
Right.
okay if people don't. But
Sure.
um, so typically, at least with the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, the characters that come to mind are just the psalmists, I think, and the narrative, as far as narrative characters go, than Job. There may be some others. I think Jeremiah, like think about some of the prophets, how they wrestle with. They're in all these characters. It's not so much uh, a doubt in the existence of God, some sort of like, do I believe that God exists, right? As much as do I believe that God is paying attention. Um, so what's wrestled with is not even so much a belief, but an experience of the absence or the presence of God. So in the Psalms, I think really get at this so well, and then maybe I can talk about Job, but just to start with the psalmist, because lament is an important part. In other words, for the lament Psalms, we might think of protest or a complaint. And most of these lament Psalms, like one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 89 for this. So Psalm 89 starts out by confessing belief, right? So I believe that you are a God committed to steadfast love, that you have made these promises, and you are going to fulfill these promises. So like this kind of certainty almost about God's faithfulness. And then the psalmist moves into like hymns, choruses about how God has shown his faithfulness in creation, from the beginning of of time. It's really about God's majesty and God's kingship in the first stanza, and then the second stanza is about God's faithfulness and loyalty to his king. So like the Davidic promises that God made to David, that the king from David's line would sit on the throne of Judah. So these are the promises that the psalmist is pronouncing. I believe this. But then there's this major shift. It's a kind of a long psalm. There's this major shift in the psalm toward, but now, why aren't you doing what you promised? And the psalmist prays in a way that I think most Christians who I know would be really uncomfortable with. But it's saying, you made these promises, you used to be showing your power, but now we're experiencing your absence. We are not experiencing your steadfast love. We're not experiencing your faithfulness. And so their doubt is not, is God there, right? Does God exist? It's as much as, does God care about us? Is God faithful? Is he Is he present? And a lot of the Psalms then will come back to some sort of confession, or hope for the future. But that particular Psalm, so without getting too far into the weeds, is the last Psalm of book 3 of the Psalms. That's right. And the last Psalm there's 5 books within the Psalms, 5 collections. The last Psalm ends in doxology. But in that Psalm, like, there's still a note of doxology where it's praising God, but it's short and it's brief and abrupt. And it's sort of like this, I'm still here moment, or I still believe, I'm still following, but I'm waiting, right? I don't see yet your faithfulness. I'm not experiencing it, but I'm still here. To me, that gets at the way that I think, I'm sure there are differences in people's experiences of winter faith, but it does get at this kind of wrestling confession. And I love that we have those so often, those throughout the Psalms, and that testimony is there in the Bible.
Yeah, and I think, I agree. They're not wrestling with, like, they're not atheists wrestling and trying to figure out if there's a God or not. But they are, I like what you said, like, is God still paying attention? I think that's really good. I hadn't thought of that way to phrase it. But I think the question that maybe I wrestle with is, like, is God good? Is this going to be all worth it? Whatever I'm going through, is it going to be, all happy at the end and I'm going to forget about the hard things? Or, like, is God good? Is God on my side? Do you think that's similar to, excuse me?
Right, yeah. So a lot of doubt is, in modern conversation is, God, it does deal with the issue of God's goodness. Mm-hmm. The theodicy question, is God just? If God is, the kind of the classic, if God is all powerful, then how could he allow this evil to exist on earth? So he's either all powerful or all good, these types of things. And you get into kind of and I think an important, not to be neglected, philosophical conversation, but it is rooted in, to some degree, in people's experiences of evil and suffering. So it's not void of being in touch with experience, but to some degree it becomes this kind of philosophical question that is not. The lament Psalms, I think, flow out of this kind of experience of being abandoned by God.
Mm-hmm. And I think
being left alone.
I think people feel that, just most of my listeners, like, go to church and, specifically Church of Christ. And so I just wonder, like, can we talk about this stuff more? Because I think more people have that experience than actually say it. And we're so afraid, like, I agree, like, if people prayed like the Psalms, from what I've studied in the Psalms, people don't, we don't pray like that very often. But I think we could.
Yeah, it's good to try it out. I think that actually the lament Psalms are really helpful with this. Like, just try to pray like this and see what happens. Not just like what the results are. People think of prayer as pretty results oriented, but just see what happens in your relationship with God. And I think there's this kind of voice here waiting for us to take up. And when we speak it, it does shape the way that we commune and live with God. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I speak personally, like a person who has wrestled with doubts, but they tend to be sort of heady, more along the lines of the existence of God. That's not like the pinpoint of it, but just sort of, are you out there? And less so with, is God paying attention to me? I think that's that's really informed by just sort of this idea of God being all powerful and sort of abstract, where this idea of presence and absence, like, that really is throughout the Bible. Like, why aren't you paying attention to me? And God drew near and like to the Israelite slaves in Egypt, he paid attention. He heard the sounds of their cry. Well, then that means, and then he drew near and he started like, oh, and we get this image in the Bible, almost like, oh, I didn't know this was going on. I'm going to do something about this. And so the outcry to God is to say, hey, pay attention to us. And I think that's not the notion or even the experience of God that I have had personally of, I'm going to pray and sing so that God will pay attention, sing louder, that just seems ungodlike to me. And so on the one hand, I think that's kind of the notion that comes across in a lot of these Old Testament texts and how people are relating to God. But sometimes that can be hard to relate to, I think. And yet I think it's really helpful for getting out of our heads, just sort of this kind of cognitive doubt toward, working it out philosophically. I mean, and it really is in touch with maybe the experience that some people feel, especially being left alone. Anyway, that's just me saying out loud that, although I spend my time with this literature and I recognize what it's saying about God's presence and absence, on the other hand, my doubt tends to be more cognitive, and more about, does God exist than is God here or not? And yet, the more I study this, the more I take up this language, it's been really informative for me and helpful in my own faith walk to sort of sing this lament instead of sort of dwell in the question of God's existence.
What do you feel like like you said, you've had more, does not is God paying attention, but does God exist? And the more heady doubt. I think it's Brian McLaren who talks about, he has a couple of different labels for doubt, and that some of them are more intellectual and some of them are more emotional. I think mine has always been the more emotional doubt. And I'm just curious, can you pinpoint moments in your life or seasons of your life that when you've had more questions or you've, been seeking more, needed more answers, seasons or periods of what I would call winter faith, but you're learning more?
Yeah. College was a time for me where I was breaking down. There's this kind of, for me, it's sort of seasons of deconstructing and really thinking why do I believe? And then kind of rebuilding. Rebuilding is always a part of it for me. So the college was a time for that. Although it's interesting, that was a time where I was at a Christian college. I was surrounded by, I was at devotionals and worship settings almost every night of the week. And so it's paired with confession. I'll put it that way. Worship, I think, is an experience of a community with God and with other believers. There's a lot, I think, that is helpful about doubting in the midst of a worshiping community. So the college was a time for me for that, maybe because it's just sort of a natural time for thinking through things, independence and so on. I think I have had, so in some ways I live with this, but there are probably especially pointed times that grow out of conversations with sometimes other believers or sometimes non-believers about faith. And so it gets me thinking on this trajectory, even here, since we moved to Memphis, it was a couple of conversations that were happening with former friends or current friends. So conversations that were happening with friends who had been formerly been believers and were not any longer. And they've sort of experienced they went through their seasons of doubt and adventures of searching alone. So by the time I heard about it, they had already made up their minds. And so, but it's still those important conversations of, they're asking really good questions about, about the existence of God. And especially I tend to have conversations that relate to the nature of the Bible.
Right.
And this is what has become a really big teaching point for me too. And probably the source, because I was raised with a faith that was so intertwined with the authority of the Bible. That's been sort of the grounding for these conversations and this pattern. So is the Bible reliable? Has been kind of a touch point in all of these conversations. And so in times when I've been learning a lot of biblical criticism, which is wrongly framed sometimes as undercutting the authority of the Bible. Biblical criticism is just a set of really good questions to ask about how we got this Bible and who is behind how we got this and what does it teach us. So I would reframe that question as, what is it authoritative for? In what way is it authoritative, more than just the assumption that everything has to be accurate in the historical scientific sense to be authoritative. But early on, those were questions I was wrestling with. And so when I would be presented with biblical criticism, even in seminary or in my PhD work, or now this is what I teach, I'm always working through doubt or dealing with doubt, or I don't know, it's dealing with doubt as much as, dealing with those questions that grow out of that kind of wrestling with the validity and the authority of the Bible.
Yeah.
Yes, I was doing that in college. I was doing that in seminary. I was doing that in my PhD work, and I'm still doing that in my teaching.
I think you're right, Lance. And something that I forget, just because I'm in a new, I moved from Memphis to Raleigh. I'm out of the kind of theological circles. Like, I'm still in church and have friends that went to seminary and stuff, but I think I forget that for our movement specifically, it's not so much doubting God, doubting the goodness of God. It's wrestling with a understanding of Scripture. And that actually, you got me thinking, because it's like, that's probably what people really, really wrestle with more. I think that's actually a better way to frame it, is like, okay, the Bible is different when you were in 4th grade and you had flannel graphs and that's how you learned Scripture. Yeah. And then you went to college and then you took your Old Testament class and your New Testament class and a couple other classes, non-Bible majors. And then you're like, now you're raising kids, or you're working through like your job and you go to church with other people that are not Church of Christ. And then you're trying to figure out like, what do I do with this book? 66 books,
Yeah, and there's a real danger that comes along with like bibliolatry, right? So that I'll sometimes sort of provocatively say in my classes that I don't believe in the Bible, because that's sort of shocking. I want to but then I always refine that, because I think a lot of the reasons for people in our movement and more Bible-oriented, some evangelical type of context, is that they're raised to believe in God because of the authority of the Bible. Yeah. It's like the foundations, right? But then there's this other side, that people who leave faith and don't believe in God, it's because of the lack of authority of the Bible. So like they mirror each other. This kind of wrong-headed notion of what the Bible is at once the foundation for a lot of people's faith, I think a faulty foundation, but it's also like the evidence against the existence of God somehow. And I know there's more to it than all of this. I do think experience and, there's more to these decisions, but the Bible is still kind of this touch point for both sides arguing for and against Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that, I think, does flow out of a misunderstanding of what the Bible is and how it's authoritative and how we read it and what kinds of questions we ask of it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so there's plenty that goes on to it. For me, it's one of the major reasons that I'm passionate about thinking about like the backgrounds of the Bible and how the Bible came to be and how we read it and the kinds of questions we ask of it.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was you, Lance, or somebody else, but I think of you regardless, that kind of taught me some of the stuff, from Pete Enns and some of the work that he's done. He has a book on, I can't remember the name of it. I have it somewhere behind me, but like he has like his parenting book with the Bible. Have you seen that one?
Okay. No, I didn't expect that one.
And I
The Bible tells me so and things, or he has.
Yeah, no, this one is like specifically how to teach your kids. And
Oh, okay.
I really,
Yeah, I've heard
really
him talk about that.
I really have enjoyed that. And it's been really helpful for me to explain it to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think Pete Enns does a really good job. And I mean, I know people don't like him, whatever, but like, I just think he's been really helpful for me. And so I guess I'm curious who have been the people, I mean, I'm sure he's one of them too, but who have been the people that maybe have helped you the most with your view of scripture at this point?
Yeah, that's a hard one because
There's probably
it's
a
happened
lot
really
of stuff.
slowly for me over time. But yeah, I mean, I'll just say I'm a fan of, I still assign inspiration, incarnation. I always get that, whether it's incarnation. Yeah, that's the way it goes.
No, I think that's right.
To my students, because not so much because I think it's like a rock solid argument for everything, but yeah, I think it's a really nice book for opening conversation and acknowledging kind of the origins of our Bible. And he's writing to evangelicals who might be sort of wrestling with these questions. And so I think his trajectory, and he also writes that in this when he was still teaching at a conservative evangelical seminary. So it's like he's being overly, I would use more hard hitting examples than he does, but he's still making, I think, a lot of really good points. And so he has been I think an important voice, especially for the particular community we're talking about, where evangelicals who are not rethinking, but like being especially with biblical questions, are being faced with historical criticism or just kind of basic science, and that are kind of tearing at the roots of their faith. And so I think he and his podcast has been helpful for a lot of folks. For me, it's faithful teachers and professors along the way who live their faith and have wrestled with a lot of biblical criticism, starting with my dad, like from being young. And then, I grew up, I didn't know a lot of the Church of Christ things growing up. I don't know about you, Andy, but I would suspect that it was similar. Like, I didn't know the 5 acts of worship until I went to college and I heard other like Church of Christ people talking about these things. I grew up hearing sermons about Jesus and really being like, so obviously the Bible was important. I knew that. That was the book for me. But really at the heart of my faith was being a follower of Jesus and the things that's really gospels focused. I think that served me well for not having like to have this kind of major crisis or conversion of faith. So it's been progressive. So professors at York, I went to York College and then Harding School of Theology, where I am now, professors there who other fellow students. I remember, conversations about Paul, and Paul's sociology and theology sort of growing up together. You can't separate them from one another. I remember conversations in class about kind of how contexts, ancient Near Eastern contexts matter. So like Fortner, I'm sure you've been talking about, he was helpful to me. And it's a good example of lots of others. Alan Black was helpful to me. And then since that time, I mean, it's just kind of a constant conversation. My students are helpful to me now, sort of working together in that. It's hard for me to pinpoint like this person shaped everything the way that I think about these things.
But you do. We're similar. It's like those. It's very relational. Like we grew up in a place that's very relational, and if it's one thing that I've learned is like when you have a healthy community that you can process whatever you're going through in life, it's usually better. When you're isolated processing everything, you're not getting feedback, you're not getting other people's opinions. That's when people, I think, go down a more difficult path. Maybe they eventually come out, but it's definitely more difficult and probably significantly less enjoyable if you're not doing it with a community.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why it's so important for churches to not just be open to doubt and conversations and questioning, but to actually anticipate it and look for ways to ask the questions first.
For churches to anticipate what people are gonna.
Yeah, so I think about, I think it's actually every comparison breaks down to some extent, but to think about parents talking to their kids about sex.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And do we want our kids to learn about sex from the internet and YouTube, or or do we want them to have some sort of voice of wisdom who can frame it correctly and teach them about it? So if churches ought to be leading the way in teaching their young folks and having conversations about the most intimate and personal matters. And clearly faith is one of those, right? I mean, do we want people to wrestle with their doubts on the internet? Or do we want people to wrestle with their doubts in a community of faith? Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of people who don't feel welcome they sense at least that they would be ostracized if they raised questions in the faith community. And then, so they don't ask the questions, so they they Google things. And there's all sorts of, I would call it sort of faithless information. So outside of the church, and it's not all bad. It doesn't mean that the church has like a corner on it everything that's true. It's just that there's a healthy way, I think, to ask these questions within a faith context. And churches need to not just be able to have that one person you could have a side conversation with, within the church, but in some ways like lead into asking some of these questions and helping. But a lot of churches aren't there themselves. So to me, that's where the relationships happen. For me, that's been my experience. I've had faithful Christians to walk alongside who are open to my questions, or maybe even have been the first to ask the questions, that have witnessed to me that they struggle with the existence of God, or the messianic identity of Jesus. Whenever I hear like a mentor of mine ask a question like that, or say, yeah, I sometimes think about that, it's sort of like shocking, and yet it totally welcomes me into having that conversation with them and not just independently. I think it's a real detriment to a lot of people walk away from faith because they don't have a conversation partner in the church.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I mean, that's somewhat of what I'm trying to do, is to have a little small corner of the world where I can at least bring up stuff with people that that I talk to, and it's kind of
Hmm.
it's kind of neat to be able to get your insight recorded, because I know I've heard some of it before, but now now I can
Hmm.
capture it for all time. Um,
Yeah. I may have said one other thing, and I mentioned this earlier, but for me, just personally, worship has been really essential in sort of when we sing. I know we're not doing a lot of that these days, but when we sing, we and when we pray, we sort of demonstrate our faith. These are the things I believe. And in fact, like we sing songs that our church sometimes the alliance of like, man, I'm not sure I believe that, but I sing it anyway, and I'm singing it with the community. And it's okay to say, I think that experience, that cognitive dissonance that might come along with that, that's okay. But also, it draws me into an experience of God's presence. And it's healing and it's informative. It's not just brain activity, it's bodily activity, an experience of being with God. And when we commune, one thing that I often remind myself is that I'm still walking, I'm still pursuing God, I'm still loved by God. These kind of confessions and that still word is really important to me. That when I take the cup and eat the bread, it's saying, I'm following, I'm a disciple. And that's at root, like where I will always be. That will always be my confession. This will always be my pursuit to follow Jesus. And then, yeah, it doesn't always look it often looks messy. There's sin involved, right? There's forgiveness involved, but like the greatest joys that I have ever experienced have been in following Christ. And I think the Eucharist and worship, it's not what it's all about, but it's when we do that together as a community, God works in those events. And it really, for me, it's been uh, this reminder. I don't know, not just even a reminder, but it has grounded my faith often in times when I've been really wrestling with faith at the same
well,
time.
that's man. I think I'll probably close with that because that was really good. That was really good.
Okay.
That was really good. I mean, man, it's so true, and especially right now with all of us. Well, at least for us, like, I mean, I haven't gone to church since
Yeah.
February, and so the worship part, I do really miss that. And I
Yeah.
think that's a good point that you're making, that I've totally forgot, is like how often, oh yeah, this did, I think about singing at WCYC or singing at Oak Haven or maybe at
Hmm.
Harding, but probably more so before college,
Hmm.
where my faith was a lot more emotional and a lot more tied to worship maybe than it is now. But now it's like I'm going back to it because I want my kids to experience some worship the way I experienced it. And you're
Hmm.
praying that that happens, and how much that does. It is very healing and, like you said, informative to our faith.
Yeah,
I
and
forget that a
emotion
lot.
gets a bad
So
rap, but emotion is from God, right? God gives us the
yeah.
ability to imagine so that we can better commune with God. I mean, it's not just God doesn't want our faith just to be about cognition. That's our brains are important, loving God with all your mind.
Hmm.
But like your whole body is involved in this, and so I think those experiences matter. They should inform our faith.
Cool. One of my last questions, which is a light question, is what is making you laugh this week,
Hmm.
maybe today, but or just in general, however you want to do it. But what makes you laugh? That's my closing. So
Laughing. My children often make me laugh. My and not just my children are teenagers, and they're really funny. Um, so like, it's not just the silly things my kids do that I sort of chuckle inside, but I often find myself laughing side by side with my kids at their quick-wittedness or a story from their experiences. So, I mean, sometimes it's TV, right? So we're just watching TV together or something. Or sometimes it's a one-liner. I think all of my kids are funny. Clay,
Yeah.
my son is probably, he picks on my wife in really beloved ways, really loved ways. And I try not to laugh too much because I know the wisdom in that, but it's also really, she's a good sport about it. And we also often have laughs about some of that.
So
a lot of family joy. I know joy is more than just laughter, but
yeah, I agree.
That's
I agree. Your kids are funny. Clay, at one point at one of your house, we were carving pumpkins, and you were like, yeah, at some point, like, they get tired of doing this, but we still do it. And Clay's carving out the word Pampers for his pumpkin. For
I was looking
everybody
for a laugh.
for everybody to see.
He often gets it from me. I mean, a
So
laugh from me. This week he's a senior in high school. He would not love that I'm talking about him on a podcast right now, but
we can edit stuff.
This week he's applying for colleges, and there's one where he's looking that they have an app for finding roommates.
Okay.
Like you put your personal stuff up there, what you like, and you put a picture up and things,
sure,
so that you can find somebody to communicate with, maybe room together with. Anyway, when he did that, he put a picture up of himself, but it was like him at 8 years old running. And it's just like, that's the kind of thing where like, he's only doing that to get a laugh and to pick on my wife, who would like him to put himself as he is, but he's like, no, I'm not. So it's that kind of thing that's pretty funny. And on the one hand, yeah, you need to take some things serious in life. On the other hand, I remember what I was like in college, and it was mostly goofy.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking some time for me, Lance. Always good to catch up.
We'll have to talk about Job sometime. I know I didn't get to Job, but we'll have to do that.
To be continued.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure. Well, blessings to you, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. So I'll stop the recording. I'll pick somewhere in there.